Welcome back to this continuation of our talk on the educational thought of Maria Montessori. Last time, we spoke at length about the kind of seeing that Maria Montessori would have us cultivate as teachers. We also investigated her views on teacher training and preparation. What does she think is most important for us to know? And what characteristics must we embody as teachers? In the second half of our lecture on Montessori, I want to discuss with you the need for an appropriate learning environment, as well as the importance of providing material objects that are best suited to the particular needs of the children who, by working with these items, are to be educated. So, let's first look at what Montessori has to say about building an appropriate learning environment. She writes that all spiritual development is a conquest of consciousness. That means essentially that when we learn, we do so by overcoming certain obstacles, by meeting certain challenges, by exposure to certain experiences and questions and so forth. Now, look at the child in this regard. A child grows when she learns, right? She's interested in something that comes to her attention. She wants to know all about it. Or maybe she wants to see what she can do with it, or how it works. Whatever it is, how many times do we catch ourselves saying, "No, you might break that," or "No, you're too little," or "That's not the way to do that. Do it like this, see?" Montessori calls this our stinginess towards children. When we're so careful to ensure that kids aren't breaking our precious things, or that they're not going to have an accident trying a thing, when we render failure not an option, or maybe when we interfere because the way they're doing X isn't the best or most efficient way of doing it, really, says Montessori, we're impeding their development and growth. Kids learn by doing, and most especially by working. And what they're working at isn't so much the accomplishment of some external end. It therefore doesn't really fit with our adult notions of work, where we work in order to achieve X. Nope. Kids, says Montessori, work for intrinsic purposes, not towards any outside goal, not instrumentally, or to serve a utility function. Kids work because they're growing, developing kids. Birds gotta sing, fish gotta swim, kids gotta work, in her view. When they work, says Montessori, this is the manner of their becoming fully human and self-realized. It's the manner of what she calls their incarnation or normalization. We'll investigate those terms more carefully in a little bit. But for now, just keep it simple and understand the main thing here. Namely, that, quote, a child cannot develop and expand as it should because an adult represses it. That in so doing, adults claim for themselves an almost divine power, making themselves gods to their children, making them in their own image, unquote. Here again, Montessori warns us as adults against our pride, as discussed in the first half of this lecture. Adults, it must be recognized if we're honest with ourselves, get kind of impatient with our children, don't we? When my kids were little, I used to read them Dennis Lee's poetry, much of which I can still remember from such frequent recitations. There's one poem in his book, Jelly Belly, that went something like this. Dawdle, 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 it's the daddies and the mums. dawdling with their apple juice, dawdling with their crumbs. So it's hurry up and scurry up and hurry, scurry, worry up. Thank goodness there are kids around to make them stop their dawdling. How true a depiction of our adult impatience with the dawdling child. The one who takes forever to do a single thing that would take you or I 2 seconds. And yet here, Dennis Lee turns the complaint around in a way that delights children. He has them laughing at their parents as dawdlers. And as the ones, therefore, who try the patience of kids, eh? Why is it that the things we think are important and worthwhile are the things that really matter? Why is it that the time children take for their own ways and deeds is such an imposition on us and the rhythm of our busy lives? As Montessori remarks, kids have a different rhythm than adults. They move slower, don't they? And the adult tendency is to substitute himself and his own ideas about what is best or most worthy of doing for a child's by acting in his place, by subtly imposing his will, perhaps suggesting alternatives in a way that means the child loses his own personality in the activity, with the result that his own emerging capacity to think and the judge may be repressed. This is why Maria Montessori speaks often of a mysterious and universal blindness among adults in relation to children as, quote, one of the greatest mysteries of the human soul. However, all is not lost in the land of adult consciousness in Montessori's view. She intimates that, she intimates what she calls a general awakening of consciousness among adults during her day. Maybe in part because she envisions her own pedagogical approach to children as a kind of harbinger of a new dawn of seeing in education. And let's never forget the powerful mystical experience that Montessori had all those years ago as she gazed with the eyes of love at the children in her care, eh? The miracle of life she saw in each and every child, and the gratitude that filled her heart, the strange manner in which this loving gaze transformed the learning of her students. If such a gaze could be institutionalized, if it could be enculturated in teachers en masse and supported administratively, if children's lives could be made to benefit from what is learned in the depths of such a gaze, well, why couldn't there be such a new dawn in education, eh? But on the other hand, is this how educational transformation really works? Can it occur en masse? Can a system or an approach to teaching, say, a method with its set of habits, its particular environment, and its specialized materials, ensure that such a new dawn will be effected in each classroom, within each teacher, and for each student? Or is the new dawn that Montessori envisions rather more uncertain than this? Is it perhaps a personal affair of the heart, an inward mourning of the soul that maybe we only on rare occasions experience or intimate? Like Thoreau describes in his book Walden. Let me quote him for you now. All memorable events, I should say, transpire in the morning time and in a morning atmosphere. The Vedas say, all intelligence awake with the morning. Poetry and art, and the fairest and most memorable of the actions of men date from such an hour. All poets and heroes, like Memnon, are the children of Aurora, and emit their music at sunrise. To him whose elastic and vigorous thought keeps pace with the sun, the day is a perpetual morning. It matters not what the clocks say or the attitudes and labors of men. Morning is when I am awake, and there is a dawn in me. Moral reform is the effort to throw off sleep. Why is it that men give so poor an account of their day if they have not been slumbering? They are not such poor calculators. If they had not been overcome with drowsiness, they would have performed something. The millions are awake enough for physical labor, but only 1 in a million is awake enough for effective intellectual exertion. Only 1 in 100 million to a poetic or divine life. To be awake is to be alive. And I've never yet met a man who was quite awake. How could I have looked him in the face? Unquote. Whew. This isn't to say that an education system couldn't exist that invites and encourages daily efforts at mindfulness like those envisioned here by Thoreau. But it is to say that even Thoreau the author admits that he himself, who made daily efforts at such mindfulness, was not himself such a one, and that he'd never yet met a man who was quite awake. Which returns us to our quandary. How does Maria Montessori evaluate her own school system? What status does it have for her? Is it, for her, akin to a place of contemplation and activity designed environmentally to foster such inward mornings, uncertain as such things may be? Or does she attribute something more power, or does she attribute even more power to her schools than this? At times, I think she does seem to speak millennially about her own Montessori-style education system, imagining the emergence of, quote, a new educational epoch, and the emergence of, quote, a new species of man, almost an overman or an Ubermensch type figure, since in her view, quote, the normal education of a child should thus lead to man's transcendence. Now, I don't want to be alarmist here, folks, and I haven't read everything that Maria Montessori ever wrote to get a clear sense of just how much she exemplifies such fevered millenarian tendencies. On the whole, I think she's very good and earnest and practical, but it seems to me that this smallest of tendencies towards fervor is something that we might watch out for whenever we enter a school system to embrace its trends, whenever we're pushed to pick up this or that mantle or method, or whenever we're pressured to drink the Kool-Aid of any system that claims to offer prepackaged, systematized salvation for all the world's ills. And let me be clear, I'm not sure that Montessori is actually doing that, only that sporadic comments throughout her books sometimes occasionally tend in this direction. At any rate, the general awakening of consciousness of which Maria speaks is worth considering. In her view, adults who are exposed to Montessori school programs can come to see what before escaped their notice about their own children. Namely, that a child doesn't have the same feeling for order that we do. Experience, in her words, has made us different. Maria's writing on this matter is, as always, supported by her very careful, conscientious, and scientific observations of children. And what she noticed most wonderfully, for instance, about 2-year-olds, is that they're interested in what is invisible, or at least what is found on the fringe of consciousness. They see what we don't see, ladies and gentlemen. They have such an eye for what we overlook and take for granted. Such things are marvels to them. I remember when my son was little, maybe in kindergarten or just prior to that, we went to the park next to our house, as we always did during the day, to play on the monkey bars and the slides and the swings with the other children. Anyway, in Calgary, most of the playground areas are covered with fine gravel to make for soft landings. When you walk up to the park as an adult, you pretty much take it for granted that the gravel's there, and that it's gray, that it gets in your kid's pants all dusty, and you'll likely spend half an hour at least afterwards when you get home picking gravel out of the carpet or kicking it across the hardwood floors, mistakenly scratching the shit out of it, maybe sucking it up out of the couch with a vacuum. You know what's going to happen there, right? So, here I am, sitting on the bench, watching my son play, and he's running back and forth, from the gravel bed to the bench area, placing little pebbles of gravel on the concrete slab at my feet. I figure, okay, what's this all about? So I get down real close to the ground with my feeble, smashed, middle-aged eyes, and I look at this gravel up close like a kid might. And what do I see? I notice that all that gray, shitty gravel that I just kind of walked past and resigned myself to cleaning out of my house is actually not gray at all. Phoenix, that's my son's name. He's bringing little red ones, and then blue ones, and white ones, black ones, green ones. There are speckled ones, and shiny ones, quartzite ones, smooth ones, rough ones. He sorted them all out. There's a friggin' rainbow of rocks when you get real small. But if you just look at it with an adult's eyes, all you see is gray pains in the ass. So, Maria Montessori's basic lesson here is that children and adults notice different things. And that if we're to bring about a transformative elevation of consciousness in our own lives that might in turn help us help our children, we need to start recognizing this fact. Montessori writes, quote, "We can perceive evidence of a child's inner life in the way he immerses himself in the fixed contemplation of minute things that are of no concern to us. But one who is attracted by the smallness of an object and focuses his attention upon it does so not because it's made a striking impression upon him, but simply because his contemplation of it is an expression of an affectionate understanding." Unquote. I also remember this with my eldest daughter, who's now in college. When she was just a baby, we'd sit her on the floor among all the toys and the things we had for her to play with, and we'd go about our business cleaning or cooking or whatever. Anyway, before you knew it, you'd turn around and there'd be baby Jasmine with some teeny tiny unpleasantry in her hand. Some long ago bit of food. Like just some forgotten piece of waste on the ground. Some bit of crud off a boot. Some tiny ball of lint, or maybe a push pin. God knows where that came from. She'd say to us, "Grubs! Grubs!" Yup, little kids are real grub finders, eh? They have an awareness of the minute details that we overlook. They see invisible things that we don't see. In Montessori's words, quote, "A child's psychic personality is far different from our own, and it's different in kind, and not in simply degree," unquote. To return to our discussion of the second of the three elements that Maria Montessori deems most necessary for a good education, namely, the construction of an appropriate learning environment. For her, this means creating a space in which kids are free to grow and to be spontaneous in their explorations, doing the work that they feel they must do by some dint of their nature that bubbles up. Because Montessori was always working with very small children, say between ages 2.5, 6, She spoke of the particular need among adults to respect what she called the various sensitive periods that children naturally must undergo as part of their growth processes. By this term, sensitive periods, she means, quote, a special sensibility which a creature acquires in its infantile state, while it's still in the process of evolution, unquote. She writes that study of these sensitive periods is one of the most important sciences dealing with human beings, and she thinks that such studies are part and parcel of the dawning of this new educational epoch she supposes is arising in current-day history. Montessori tells us that a child's sensitive period lasts until he's almost 5. Among these periods of the first 5 years, she includes crucial times in which the children are acquiring language, showing interest in small objects, demonstrating concern for order, developing sensory refinement, and learning appropriate social behaviors. Indeed, it was during her time at that first Casa dei Bambini that Maria originally encountered what she calls the miraculous learning of children during this time in their lives. In her own words, quote, childhood thus passes from conquest to conquest in a constant rhythm that constitutes its joy and happiness. It's within this fair fire of the soul, which burns without consuming, that the creative work of man's spiritual world is brought to completion. Unquote. She's a good writer, eh? These sensitive periods are really times in which children's own deep, mysterious nature drives their movement, activity, and inquiry. When what Montessori calls the guiding instincts of these periods are allowed to unfold, to exert and to express themselves, indeed, when they're encouraged to thrive, these drives serve as the force and the energy of each child's own inner nature. Moreover, Montessori suggests rather emphatically that they're far better guides to what's best for each child than the ideas and expectations we cook up for them as adults, since their own inclinations erupt as, quote, divine thoughts, being elaborated within the intimacy of the living being, and are marked by a knowledge and wisdom that guides these beings in their voyage through time and an eternity, unquote. Hence, careful attention to the needs of children during these sensitive periods, careful construction of their learning environments in such a way as to foster the free and spontaneous investigation and work that children must do by dint of their nature during these periods, gives rise to the performance of what Montessori calls stupendous acts of learning. Just think, for instance, about how amazing it is that these little kids learn a language with no other language previous to guide them. How they learn the meaning of all the things they see, how they settle into a world so new to them, so incredibly, and with such swiftness, almost effortlessly, it seems, especially when you think about that time in college when you tried to pick up a new language, eh? Little kids put us grown-ups to shame in their learning powers, don't they? Contrastingly, when we clamp down on children, when we divert them from their intents and their natural inclinations or so-called vital impulses, their subsequent failure to follow out these impulses means that they become helpless and inept, says Montessori. So you can hear the urgency of her pleas here to her readers when she writes about these hidden things in her book, The Secret of Childhood. In her view, and as one who has observed and interacted with many, many children in many, many different schools all around the globe, if a child has not been able to act according to the directives of his or her sensitive period, the opportunity of a natural conquest is lost, and lost for good. She wants us to begin to acknowledge and to respect this secret, miraculous work of nature that occurs quietly and unnoticed in each child's soul. Montessori writes, quote, "A divine command is breathing upon this helpless being and animating it with its spirit. This inner drama of the child is a drama of love. It's a great reality unfolding within the secret areas of his soul and at times completely absorbing it." Unquote. And so Montessori contends that to assist a child, we must provide him with an environment which will enable him to develop freely. Each child, in her view, is passing through a period of self-realization. But what, then, would such a learning environment look like? Montessori looks around at schools and communities already in existence, and she finds no real acknowledgement of the child's needs for freedom and growth, movement and inquiry. She writes, "Man is a builder, but where does he build a nest suitable for his child? It should be a place of beauty and uncontaminated by any outward need. It should be a place where a generous love can store up riches not used for production. Is there any place where a man feels the need to abandon his usual mode of acting, where he perceives that struggle is not an essential part of life, where he comes to realize that getting the better of others is not the secret of survival, and where as a consequence self-renunciation seems to be the true source of life?" Unquote. What Maria is describing in her vision of a school environment, it seems to me, is what was meant originally by the word school, when it was still rooted in the Greek word schole, meaning leisure. Now, I've discussed the ancient meaning of schole or leisure at greater length in other lectures that you may listen to online if you find yourself so interested. But here, you should simply know that what the ancients meant by leisure wasn't what we today suppose by that word. Today, we think of leisure as time when we don't have to work. It's our downtime. It's our rest time. It's recuperative time in which we recharge our batteries for more work. Or it's time for us not to be serious. Time for hobbies, vacations, seeing movies, drinking, hanging out with friends. And we definitely do not associate leisure with school, do we? Nope. We say school work, not school leisure. Experientially, I'd say even uttering the words school and leisure in the same sentence strikes us as a kind of oxymoron. But that's only because we don't any longer have any awareness or understanding that school was, at its core, a place of schole, or leisureizing. And that, by ancient standards, to have a multi-million-dollar school of business at the local university is the real oxymoron. For the opposite of schole is ascholia. It's work, or business. We can hear the difference better in the Latin word for leisure, otium, and its opposite, negotium, where we get our word negotiate, as in business negotiations. What characterizes the practice of schole or leisure, and what distinguishes it from work or business, classically speaking, is that schole is an activity for its own sake, whereas business or work is always done for the sake of something else, to achieve something else. Like when we work in order to make money, or in order to achieve a goal or outcome. Moreover, ancient schole is a kind of activity that can only happen when human beings are, for a time at least, freed from the exigencies of work and labor, when they can be free therein to activate that highest part of themselves in relation to its best or most sublime object. This activity of the human being involved in leisurizing is none other than contemplation. And what's contemplation? Again, I have a good number of other online lectures that you might listen to for further clarification on this point. But here, suffice it to say that contemplation is nothing other than this loving gaze that the teacher cultivates as he attempts truly to see his pupils. Or conversely, contemplation is nothing other than that activity of the child, described just a few minutes ago by Maria Montessori when she spoke of their inner drama of love, and of the classroom as a place where a generous love can store up riches not used for production, unquote. Simply put, contemplation is knowing by loving. Now, personally, I'm convinced that the very best schooling has the cultivation and practice of schole at its core. I'm also convinced that schole is the appropriate learning environment for learning, and that such an environment is essential for children and adults who might engage in the activity of contemplation. Moreover, although the waters are a bit muddy when I say so, I think that Maria Montessori seeks to cultivate some sort of schole environment in her own schools as well. For much of what she says about the work of children is very similar to what might be said about schole, or true leisurizing. And it's imperative that you understand what is meant by the word contemplation at this point. Even though Montessori doesn't use it, this word, contemplation, most aptly connects her own insights to the thousands of years old traditions that we have in the far distant past, and that these have investigated such matters of the soul and its development. Anyway, the contemplative core of Montessori's educational thought is best encapsulated by her statement that every work which is done according to the laws of nature and creates a harmony among beings attains consciousness under a form of love, unquote. Put another way, human beings come to know the world and themselves through loving. As we already discussed in the first half of this lecture, Montessori notes that adults are most likely to suppose all the most trustworthy, factual kind of knowing actually comes from not loving. That is, from suspending our love, from being objective, by holding the world apart from ourselves as an object for mastery. But, in accord with the world's great wisdom traditions, Montessori recognizes a deeper knowing, perhaps the core of all knowing. She recognizes that it's made available to us when we love. This second form of knowing, Montessori most associates with little children in their so-called sensitive periods. She remarks, quote, that irresistible impulse which unites a child with the objects about him during the sensitive periods is actually a love for his environment. It is, in her view, an intellectual desire or love which enables a child to hear and to see and thus develop. This cognitive mode she calls the intelligence of love, unquote. And here is the genuine marvel of children for Montessori. Here, among the smallest of children, with their capacity for contemplation, for that loving gaze that the ancients valued as the highest form of human activity, Maria once again spies out the tragic blindness of adults, a blindness that arises due to the very fact of our unloving attitude towards knowing, and the manner of our taking everything so badly for granted. Ruminating on this contrast between the propensities of adults and children towards the contemplative loving gaze, she writes, quote, "It's the love that enables a child to observe in a keen and ardent fashion those features of his environment which are quite significant to adults because they lack a child's animation." I'm going to read that again because I missed a word. It is love that enables a child to observe in a keen and ardent fashion those features of his environment which are quite insignificant to adults because they lack a child's animation. Do you understand that? Love lets kids see things that you and I don't see. Okay? Does not love make us sensible to things which are not noticed by others? Does it not reveal to us details and special qualities that are not appreciated by others? Because he's in love with his environment and not indifferent to it, a child's intelligence can see what is invisible to adults. Unquote. In this passage, we can hear precisely why Christ's words in Matthew 18 struck such a deep resonance with Montessori. "Truly I tell you, unless you change and become like little children, you'll never enter the kingdom of heaven." Montessori saw the truth of these words firsthand in her children's house. She saw that a child's love and his surroundings, or rather, a child's love of his surroundings appears to adults as the natural joy and vivacity of youth. Happiness is therefore associated for Montessori with children and their innate capacity for this loving gaze. Moreover, she saw how badly misunderstood are children ordinarily on this account. We grossly undervalue and misjudge their leisurizing and their play as time wasted, as inefficient and unproductive. How badly we overlook our own children, whom we love, even in our most sincere efforts to love them. How badly we fail to see them or to understand them, even as we act upon what we consider to be best for their welfare and future happiness. And not only does Montessori find in children a paradigm for the transformation of our own consciousness as adults who need to learn how to see like little children once more, so too does she find in children the very best exemplars for us of how to forgive others. Forgiveness is something we find most difficult as adults, I think. We can hold bitterly to the slights and injustices of others with whom we work or whom we've loved and lost, for instance. And we hold bitterly to our own failures and missteps, perhaps even less forgiving of these than of anything else. And then, as parents and teachers, how often do we end a family meal or a day in the classroom feeling like shit because none of these kids ever seem to appreciate all that we've done for them? Can't they appreciate how hard we've been working for them? And yet, Maria advises us to take stock, to remember our own faults before those of others, and to forgive. For, quote, "A child's normal energies teach us a lesson in forgiving. From the depth of his nature, the child repeatedly pardons the adult and strives to flourish despite the latter's repressions." Unquote. So yes, these children before us may indeed be ungrateful at this moment, and in many future moments as well. But try to remember that thus far in their lives, they've been great and consistent forgivers towards adults and the adult world generally, which constantly tramples upon and represses their own spontaneity and their urgent need for growth. So, now you know a bit about what Montessori has to say regarding the appropriate learning environment for education. This was the second of her 3 components for a damn fine educational experience after a humble teacher. In a Montessori school, such learning environment is created by means of a few very basic elements. Namely, and I'll just enumerate them here for you, these are important. Namely, children ought to be given lots and lots of choice in their daily activities. Right? If you look at a Montessori school, kids are up to all different sorts of things, and they get to pick. They don't get told, they get to pick, okay? And they ought to be enabled to repeat these exercises as many times as they like. They like doing the same thing over and over again. It's just like at night when you get your own kid and you're laying in the bed. Tell me that story, right? It's the same story you've read 100 times. Why? They like the same thing over and over again, okay? Also, the focus in Montessori schools is upon work rather than play, which Montessori equates with aimless or trivial occupations, lacking real grounding in the cultivation of a child's true nature, unlike work. So this is a way that she speaks about work versus play. Okay? And finally, neither rewards nor punishments make up any part of a Montessori learning environment. Okay, so these components of Montessori education must be understood always in relation to the overall atmosphere, which it seems to me is one of schole or leisure. That is, it must be one in which the loving gaze of contemplation is cultivated. Now, mind you, Montessori doesn't use these specific terms I've asked you to consider just now. She doesn't call what she's doing with kids by the name of schole. Indeed, in a way that may be confusing for you right now, given what I've just said, she actually calls the atmosphere of her Montessori schools one of work. Oh! Admittedly, this contradiction confused me at first when I encountered it too. See, I had a really great student last year in the B.Ed program. Prior to enrolling for teacher training, she taught for 14 years as a Montessori instructor internationally. And that's really something. Anyway, one day in our classes together, I was talking about the resonances between leisure and play and contemplation, and how essential these things are in classical understandings of education. And this very fine student pointed out that in Montessori schools, the kids don't play. They work. Well, that struck me as very strange indeed. It filled me with perplexity, and it challenged me to go back and revisit what Montessori had to say about work. I had no reason to disbelieve my student about Montessori. I knew her very well, and I trusted her to know Montessori's approach, especially given her vast hands-on experience. And yet, how was I going to make sense of this apparent contradiction that flies in the face of all I know about education? How does this notion of work that appears in Montessori's books and in Montessori teacher training jibe with what else we know from her writings? So a discussion right now about Montessori's understanding of work is certainly in order. Unfortunately, it means you'll have to sit and listen for a wee bit longer. Yeah, I know. Sorry about that. But it'll also launch us nicely into consideration of the third and final element that Montessori highlights as being of utmost significance in learning, namely, making available the appropriate materials with which students might work in order best to learn. So, what exactly is going on when Montessori is talking about work? After all, the drudgery of school is work. Certainly doesn't seem to be what Montessori would be aiming for, eh? And then, when she speaks about a child's work as being intrinsically motivated as opposed to centered on external or utilitarian goals, Well, this pretty much disqualifies it as work, at least in the way we normally think about work, eh? Not only that, all the stuff we've learned thus far about Maria Montessori makes it sound like what she really means by work is actually more what, classically speaking, was meant by its opposite, namely leisure or schole, and its prime activity of contemplation. So what gives here? Our use of words can be really confusing sometimes. Well, let's begin by examining what Montessori says about what she calls the child's instinct to work. She writes that the most important of her own discoveries as an educator is, quote, that a child returns to a normal state through work. What does this mean? I said earlier in this lecture that we talk about the meaning of the term normalization, as Montessori uses it. Now's as good of a time as any. By normalization, Montessori means that such a child is, quote, precociously intelligent, he's learned to overcome himself and to live in peace, and he prefers a disciplined task to futile idleness. I guess that's key right there. Like when she talks about a disciplined task, that's kind of like work, right? Versus futile idleness, that's kind of like play for Maria. Anyway, elsewhere in The Secret of Childhood, she writes that, quote, normal children move about in a calm and tranquil manner. They can be seen standing still for a long time and paying thoughtful attention to a single object. They prove in a striking way that calm and measured movement, accompanied by thoughtful consideration, are the marks of a normal child. Here we see how the normalized state of being for children is not rambunctiousness and distractedness, but rather a kind of contemplative repose and an engaged loving that is seeing. We see this most especially in the daily practice of silence in Montessori schools. Take, for instance, Maria's accounting of the first time she tried this exercise at the children's house, where she asked all the children to try and be as quiet as the little baby she held in her arms. She writes, "Here was something that rose up from a deep desire. The children all sat perfectly still, breathing as quietly as possible, having on their faces a serene expression like those who are meditating. This was the origin of our exercise of silence," unquote. Here indeed is found a deep, contemplative, reverential mood among children. Having witnessed many such periods of silence, Montessori contends children are not only sensitive to silence, but also to a voice that calls them almost inaudibly out of that silence, unquote. These deeply contemplative states are therefore part and parcel of the normalization of children, in her view. So when Maria talks about children being normalized, some of us get our hackles up nowadays. Indeed, the word normal today strikes modern sentiment as offensive and judgmental, even victimizing. Normal can suggest to us being average, unextraordinary, or perhaps even subjugated and divested of all our personality. Similarly, its opposite, calling somebody abnormal, can be equally as horrible, since it suggests that we've passed negative judgment on them simply because they don't conform with what everyone else ostensibly is, or with what is expected of normal folks. But please recognize that Montessori was no Nurse Ratched from One Who Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. She's not handing out lobotomies here, nor was she an industrialist seeking to make little carbon copy workers to fill in the needs of society for automatons lacking in individuality. Nope. In some ways, when Montessori talks about normalization, she reminds me most of Rousseau when he tells his myth of the noble savage, of man in a state of nature, depicted as being innately good and peaceful, but only botched and buggered due to the caustic and corruptive influences of society, or in Montessori's mythos of adult society and expectations. I think Montessori's own Rousseauian bent comes across pretty clearly at various places in her writing. For instance, when she suggests that civilization has slowly withdrawn the natural environment from the child, and that, quote, a child is a natural being living in the midst of adults. He finds himself in an alien atmosphere, unquote. Or again, in The Secret of Childhood, Maria writes, a child is completely foreign to this organized society of adults. His kingdom is certainly not of this world, unquote. Here, of course, she mixes Rousseauian elements with allusions to the Christ within each child. Or again, elsewhere she speaks of children almost like Rousseauian noble savages when she calls them asocial beings who are encountered by adults as disturbers of the accepted grown-up socialized order of things. Their normalization, for Montessori, most certainly does not involve the smashing down into conformity of their natures. Rather, it's quite the opposite, for it involves a rediscovery of the natural man and the noble savage within, and then working with this God-given nature organically, encouraging and cultivating its natural instincts and vital impulses during the sensitive periods in order to bring about the new species and the transcendence of man envisioned by Montessori that she deems possible via education. This is why she so often writes, the child is the father of the man, after all. Mind you, I doubt Montessori would like that I've just said she has an affinity with Rousseau. At various points in her books, she takes scathing potshots at Rousseau for misunderstanding both children and education. Truth be told, however, I think her deep distaste for him is due to his atheism rather than his views on children, for again, much of what he says seems to resonate quite well with her own views. Well, in order to speak of Montessori's views about a child's normalization in a way that she'd find more amenable, we should look at its resonances with her use of the other word, incarnation. As many of you know, the word incarnation has a religious meaning that connotes the manner in which Jesus Christ is thought by Christians to be the Son of God, how he's held by them to be both God and man at once, the divine word made flesh. This is Maria's own spiritual tradition as a Catholic as well. And yet, the incarnation isn't simply an article of faith for her. It's not just part of a credo to be dutifully recited. It's rather a lived experience for Maria. Recall once again her deep spiritual experience among the children at her first school. Recall how she claimed by seeing into the nature of these children, and through having gazed upon the being of each child, to have glimpsed something of the divine base in each one of them. This realization of the heaven within each one of us is precisely what Montessori means by our incarnation. This is what she means when she writes that the fashioning of the human personality is a secret work of incarnation. That a child's incarnation is effected through hidden toil, and that psychic energy must be incarnated in movement so that it can unify the personality of the agent, unquote. It takes some work, after all, to become who you truly are. and to realize who you truly are. As far as I can tell, normalization and incarnation are synonymous terms in her writing. Indeed, perhaps the word normalization is used because it had a less religious meaning, like a more clinical ring to it, and so might find appeal with a larger audience. Except now, of course, the term normalization would be found equally repugnant by modern academics and educators alike. Poor Maria, and poor us too, in our inability to hear her words without taking offense at them. How unfairly we prejudge their meanings, eh? At any rate, whether we call it normalization or incarnation, what's involved in a damn fine education system, as far as Montessori is concerned, is the rediscovery and the cultivation of our true nature, our true personality, or our true self. In Montessori's work, this true nature is variously discussed as our being made in the image of God as His incarnations, as having Christ within us, or less religiously, as being imbued with a wondrous nature that seeks to become actualized in our instincts through the free action of the vital drives of our nature and via the careful attention of a humble teacher during our sensitive periods. We come to know ourselves in either case. When such is the aim of education, the challenge, obviously, is to find ways of allowing that nature to develop spontaneously and freely according to the dictates of its being. As we have already seen, Montessori suggests that in a school situation, we can prepare to do this, as teachers, by first of all, ourselves learning how to see, by embodying the contemplative gaze in our own teaching practices, by not imposing our own will upon our students, but by withdrawing passively from the field of action and instead teaching indirectly through the manner in which we organize the environment for learning, as well as by how carefully we furnish this environment with tasks and materials that students might work upon in order that their own being might be normalized or incarnated, as the case may be. And so, once again, we come around to the subject of work and what Maria Montessori means by that word. Let me therefore quote to you an important passage from The Secret of Childhood, in which Montessori tells us about the central role of work in her vision of education. Quote, "This is the most certain datum that we have in the field of psychology and education. A child's desire to work represents a vital instinct he cannot organize, since he cannot organize his personality without working. A man builds himself through working. There can be no substitute for work. Neither affection nor physical well-being can replace it. A man builds himself by carrying out manual labor in which he uses his hands as the instrument of his personality and as an expression of his intellect and will, helping him to dominate his environment. A child's instinct for work is a proof that work is instinctive to man and characteristic of the species," unquote. Sounds like a slave driver there, eh? Well, not at all really when you come to understand what she's talking about. See, to us as adults, Montessori says that work appears as drudgery and unpleasantry because, in her words, we've lost the proper motive for working. Quote, "It's been deviated by a desire for possessions, for power, and by apathy and attachment. It's become forced labor, and as such, it's given rise to powerful psychic barriers. This is why work seems hard and repugnant," unquote. However, as Montessori writes, When, because of favorable circumstances, work flows naturally from an inner impulse, it assumes an entirely different character, even in adults. When this happens, work becomes fascinating and irresistible and raises a man above his diverted self, unquote. Here, I think Montessori is pointing out how contemplative seeing is built right into work when it's engaging. When through work, we come to see and to know ourselves and the world around us. Each of us struggles in work, yes, but as Maria points out, when a man's engaged in such war, he becomes possessed by an extraordinary power and experiences again that natural instinct that enables him to express his own individuality. It's the source of true progress in civilization. For men have a natural instinct for work, and it's through work that their environment is perfected. Work is characteristic of men, and progress in civilization is directly linked with their manifold ability to create an environment that will make life more easy and comfortable, unquote. Do you see Montessori's claims about the spiritual primacy of work and education here? There's much in her assessment of work that commends itself to our understanding, I think. And yet, there are other aspects of it that confound and trouble me. Firstly, contemplation, it seems, is too lofty a cognitive function for children. It's not the way they learn during their sensitive periods. Secondly, unlike work, contemplation is unproductive. It therefore can't be of any great value when compared with the possibilities of work for what she calls true progress in civilization, for world transformation and positive change. After all, work gets shit done, eh? When we work, we can help others as well as ourselves. And by contrast, the solitary contemplative only comes into awareness of truth and is inwardly transformed all by his lonesome. Or is he? Montessori at least is skeptical in the case of children when she writes, quote, "What makes a child a real worker is the fact that he does not develop into a man simply by rest and reflection, contemplation. Rather, he is engaged in active work." Here, I wonder if perhaps Montessori may even be suggesting a primacy or a similar primacy for work even among adults. For contemplation, classically understood, is the activity we take up when we exercise our leisure or schole. And schole implies a kind of repose from work. But what if the activity of schole is not in actuality so distinct from work at all, but is rather itself a kind of toil? This seems to be what Montessori implies about children, at least. What about among adults? I think Montessori would have us consider, is schole ever a genuine possibility for human beings? Like, is leisure ever something we can achieve? When Montessori discusses the better elements of and nobler aspects of adult life, she does not speak about them in their leisuring aspects. No, sir. Rather, she talks about their power as makers and workers, as transformers and masters of the world around them. Adult workers are beings who create not artificial but transcendent environments. They are laboring beings whose transformational powers might even give rise to a new species of man through work. That's what she says, a new species of man through work. They are, in Montessori's estimation, veritable co-creators with God. For man, in her view, builds something by himself that will be an expression of his own existence and further the ends of creation itself, unquote. Human beings, in other words, by virtue of their incarnation, that is to say, by virtue of their being made in the image of God, are co-creators of the cosmic order. It's through the work of human hands that God himself is seen to accomplish his divine plans for the world. For Montessori, it seems to be the case that the child's secret inward working is a microcosmic event not at all dissimilar to God's creation of the world ex nihilo, that is, from nothing, right? For she writes that of the child that he's so near to the very founts of life that he acts for the sake of acting. This is the way of creation, of which we neither have knowledge nor remembrance. In the world of adults, however, our works are not so secret and hidden. Rather, we're called upon as beings made in the image of God to create transcendent environments in which we might all live. Our imago Dei, like our image of God in this regard, seems to be, for Montessori, equated with God the Creator. And the Christ within us is none other than Christ as worker, Christ as the creative Word, who, I guess, saves all humanity by his creative powers. Making human beings making human beings their own saviors through divine co-creation. That's some big words and some big aspirations, I'd say. To me, it smacks of pride, personally. And it reminds me an awful lot of the tenets behind liberation theology, or actually it reminds me a bit of Marxism or historical materialism and Hegelian systems of thought, wherein, various theologians, theorists, so-called philosophers have claimed to be able to spy out some great spirit or force of history at work, grinding out transformations for the progress of man, great bloody revolutions and human suffering, all as grist for the mill of some grand plan, some divine thing, plan, something like that. Here again, I'm suspicious of Montessori for harboring certain millenarian or Gnostic tendencies, ladies and gentlemen. But that being said, I don't mean to discount all that is otherwise commendable in her pedagogical writings. After all, unlike the big speculative Gnostics like Marx and Hegel, Maria liked to keep things real and well-grounded in her loving experiences with little children. I don't think she ever moved too far from that basic goal, and I'm certain she never really harbored any insane grand revolutionary delusions like a Marx or a Hegel. At least, not very strongly. I think she was too sensitive to the problem of human pride to allow such a derailment in her thinking. Moreover, her remarks about contemplative knowing by loving are always entrenched in a careful attention to the special situation of young children. And among young children, her long experience taught her that such contemplative knowing requires the use of their tiny hands and secret toils. This is why Montessori places such an emphasis on the need for a teacher who can design a fine learning environment for children. Moreover, such a teacher must be one who can supply children with this environment amply, within this environment amply with the sorts of materials and tools that will enable them to work out their being according to the inner dictates of their own incarnating personalities. Quote, "The work of tiny hands, which are the first stammerings of man at work, So I'm losing my spot here. The work of tiny hands, which are the first stammerings of man at work, require incentives to activity in the form of objects which correspond to his desire to work. Unquote. All learning in the Montessori classroom remains contemplative, surely, for it's informed by the loving gaze. And it is indeed a knowing by loving. However, Montessori is very clear that such a love must work itself out through the movement of hands upon objects, specially designed to provide stimuli and problems suited for children as they move through each of their sensitive periods and according to the dictates of their nature. What is needed for a genuine normalizing or incarnating education, in other words, is activity concentrated on some task that requires movement of the hands guided by the intellect. Unquote. Nothing in Montessori's view is more important than to understand the deep need children have to work, which, again, is very much different from our adult attitudes towards working. Quote, a child possesses a driving force that is different from that of an adult. The adult always acts for some external motive. A child, on the other hand, does not become weary with toil. He grows by working, and as a consequence, his work increases his energy. A child never asks to be relieved of his burdens, but simply that he may carry out his mission completely alone. His very life consists in the work of growth, since he must work or die. If adults do not understand this secret, they'll never understand the work of children any more than they have understood it in the past. Unquote. A few final comments about work as it's understood by Maria Montessori flow from this provocative passage. First, note the urgency of Montessori's plea here to allow children to work. In her words, they must work or die. There's something about the process and the activity of working that's essential to their very being, something without which they die, or at least they fail to incarnate or be normalized. Second, look at the shocking observation that Maria makes here about the precious solitude required for work. The child, she says, must carry out his mission completely alone. A child doesn't look for gain or assistance in his work, and teachers must practice not intervening in a child's work, but rather leaving a child on his own. Unquote. Now, think back to all the stuff you've been learning in Teachers College about cooperative learning, about getting kids to work together, even about how 21st century learning requires that we all form networks of learners, that we internet our communications to become ever more increasingly connected to one another. And that's just the students. Now, on top of that, consider how the lives of teachers are themselves organized into committees and work teams, and how on our PDEs nobody can be left alone for a minute to plan and to work. How every bit of work must be done in conjunction with others. Folks, that's always really bugged me. I get why people like to work together, and I get why bosses like us to work together too. I get that there are efficiencies to be had, and that there are things each person can bring to a collective situation that might make for a better end product. I even get how the practice of democratic virtues for a democratic education necessitates collaboration. I'm no dummy. But there is, in my experience, something incredibly smothering, totalitarian, and Big Brother-esque about the manner in which so-called collaborative learning has overtaken educational thought. You know, Einstein's E equals mc squared wasn't a collaborative discovery. Michelangelo's painting in the Sistine Chapel? Not a groupthink moment. Mozart's compositions? Nope. And that great novel you like? Nada. I think that Maria Montessori is hip to something really core about the true nature of work as well. In her books, we find that the child's secret, deep, inner work is always done alone. That doesn't just mean that the teacher isn't always butting in. That means that it's the kid by herself working. Little Bobby and Emma can't help her perform her secret work. It's hers, and hers alone, see? True work can't be a team effort. This contemplative, incarnating, normalizing education is fundamentally an act of solitude and silence. What an uncomfortable thing to say nowadays. And Maria Montessori is not the only person who's made such astonishing claims about work, by the way. Maybe the most famous book ever written about work is by the 20th century philosopher Hannah Arendt, a figure much lauded and celebrated in the field of education, by the way. Arendt wrote a big book on the vita contemplativa, or the contemplative life, called The Life of the Mind, as well as an accompanying tome, smaller though, on the vita activa, or the active life, entitled The Human Condition. Now, whereas The Life of the Mind mostly explores what people are up to when they're engaged in schole, or the life of leisure that's freed from the need to labor, to work, and to engage in political life, The Human Condition looks at what folks are doing when they're not leisurizing. As a wrap-up to our discussion of Montessori's writings, I'd like to look at that book of Arendt's for its resonances and its dissonances, in order to see what insights we can draw from these comparisons and contrasts. Alright, so Arendt divides the active life into three main component activities. There's labor, and there's work, and there's action, pure and simple. By labor, she means those activities that correspond to feeding the beast, as it were. That is to say, to taking care of our biological processes related to the human body. We labor in order to live, and for our daily bread. We labor out of necessity, don't we? And in relation to life processes, as well as for the continuance of our species. So, an easy example would be me back in the day as a farmer. I worked the ground. I sowed seed and planted crops. I cultivated and tended them. I harvested them. Every year, well into my 20s, I grunted and sweated in this labor, and so did all my family and most of my friends in the countryside. And round it goes with the seasons. The laboring process is never ending, see? A man's always got to eat. Sooner rather than later, them vegetables got to be picked. And the products of labor are perishable too, so hurry up and sell them. Indeed, we use up the products of labor, and we have to make more on a regular basis. Now, our modern age glorifies labor as the source of all value in society. Men like Karl Marx and John Locke and Adam Smith have elevated the status of labor because of its new productivity in modern times, and due to its power to create vast surpluses of wealth. Indeed, in modern times, the labors of human beings are seen as the key to eventually conquering necessity, which is the whole point of everything, I guess, in modern times, right? Where in ancient times, labor was conceived of as the lowest form of activity, and leisure the highest, This state of affairs is now reversed. For leisure, or time away from work, has become important only as a period for consumption. Moreover, through technological progress and the creation of ever-increasing productivity, labor has become even easier. To such an extent, says Arendt, that the real effort will actually be to consume all the goods of labor. I'd always expected them all was slavery, folks. Now I'm certain of it. Spend or perish. Economies fall apart without spending and consuming. Don't they? Don't let the terrorists win. Go to the mall. Do your civic duty. That's what Arendt has to say about labor. And perhaps you can hear certain resonances and overlaps in her view on labor with what Montessori says about work, eh? Labor's a thing of necessity, says Arendt. Well, Montessori says much the same thing about child's work, doesn't he? Or doesn't she, rather? The child must labor or die. Sheesh. Or again, labor is held in modern times to be transfiguring and world transformational, says Arendt. Well, doesn't Montessori make similar claims about human beings and their work to create a transcendent environment and a new species of human? How do you make sense of these overlaps? So much for Arendt on laboring. Work, by contrast, corresponds to the unnaturalness of human existence. Arendt points out that if one might be said to labor with one's body, then one works with one's hands. As a laborer, man is a kind of servant of nature, but in work, he's its master and its conqueror. His working provides an artificial world of things not related to propagation. Moreover, true works are lasting as opposed to perishable goods. They endure beyond the span of a given lifetime. So they're different than the works of labor, right? Some good examples of work here might be the Sistine Chapel, or Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, or Hannah Arendt's book, The Human Condition. Like Montessori, Arendt draws our attention to the recurring idea in history, really arising from the influence of Christianity, that the quality of man's life as worker and as creator is the imago Dei in man. However, the human being creates not ex nihilo, but from raw materials he has mastered and in some way done violence to. Arendt notes that experience of this violence is the most elemental experience of human strength, and therefore the very opposite of the painful, exhausting effort experienced in sheer labor, unquote. Any pleasure to be found in work has to do with mastery, it seems, whereas the pleasures derived from labor come from our exertions that achieve a kind of resonance with natural bodily rhythms. Here I can relate with the joys of which Arendt speaks in relation to both work and labor. Who hasn't felt the immense satisfaction of completing a work in which he's invested so much of himself? Who hasn't felt the thrill of that conquest? Similarly, in grueling toil, who has not felt, say, in their 20s, their muscles surge and their backs harden like iron under the weight of long laboring days on a farm, or in a warehouse, in a sawmill, or in a factory? And yet, what sort of joy is it that children experience through work, as articulated by Montessori? Is this the thrill of accomplishing a task or completing a work? If so, why then the repetition? Indeed, repetition of tasks is a main component in Montessori schools, but it more closely resembles labor than work, at least in the way Arendt talks about it. For labor is circular in its nature, right? It's ever renewed. It's tied to necessity. Whereas work has a definite beginning and a definite end. So, what is this joy that children take in exerting themselves at their silent activities? How does it fit into this understanding that Arendt's articulated for us, right? There's something off about Montessori's understanding. But then again, Arendt writes that work is performed not as an end in itself, but in order to earn a means of subsistence. Work, unlike action or schole, like either action or schole, these two things aren't the same, right? Unlike either action or schole, is a means to an end. And yet Montessori is clear that the work children must do is not a means to any end. It's done for its own sake, not out of necessity to put food on the table or for the purposes of reproduction, but out of an inner necessity that the higher elements of a child's nature might be developed and bear fruit. So in this regard, it seems to me that what Montessori calls work is really much more akin to what the ancients called schole. On one point, I think that Arendt and Montessori voice considerable agreement. This concerns the manner in which work itself is a kind of theoretic or contemplative exercise. As we've seen, for Montessori, the child's work has its core, or has at its core the contemplative loving gaze. Similarly, Arendt remarks that work, say the work of a sculptor for instance, has the seeing of a specific eidos or form at its core. This form, in turn, serves as the blueprint for what will be fashioned out of the rough-hewn stone or marble slab, as the case may be. One final point of great similarity between Arendt and Montessori is their stance on cooperative achievement in work. Arendt states this matter with great precision and clarity, quote, "There can be hardly anything more alien or even more destructive to workmanship than teamwork, which actually is only a variety of the division of labor," unquote. Again, such a thought spoken aloud very likely offends most modern-day educators at their core. And yet, there is a great deal of truth to it. One wonders how this conflation of labor and work has affected our modern consciousness, our propensity for contemplative or theoretic gazing, and our overall ability to understand ourselves and the nature of our actions. A discussion of these matters, I think, would make for a really great class inquiry when next we meet, should any of you actually have listened this far into the lecture. Finally, apart from labor and work, Arendt wishes us to learn something about action, pure and simple. Action, as Arendt understands it, pertains to a kind of doing that, unlike either labor or work, does not require the manipulation of matter, but rather intercourse with other human beings. Action is the stuff of speeches and politics. Action aims at remembrance through the establishment of political bodies and in history. Action is distinguished further from both work and labor by its freedom, or it's unconcerned with what is useful. Unlike work, action is never possible in isolation. Action, it seems, has little resonance with the sorts of learning that Montessori has sought to cultivate in her schools, where the child's secret tasks are solitary and so very much resemble either work or schole, say. Action requires dialogue, discussion, and the creation of something new, but through speech, rather than via the manipulation of matter by little teeny hands, right? Children in a Montessori school, however, work upon matter in order to lay up not outward creations, but rather create themselves from nothing, ex nihilo, from within. Through their deeds and tasks, they are formed inwardly, and the child becomes, as Montessori says, the father to the man. However, like action in this regard, and unlike both labor and work, as articulated by Hannah Arendt, the child's deeds are undertaken and executed for their own sake, and not for any external purposes. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for your patience in this two-part lecture. I hope you found much food for thought in this long discussion, and I hope that we can take up some of your questions and observations together in class.